much. We're handing over for the next 80 minutes to Kit Monkman. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Kit Monkman. I'm one half of an artist duo called KMA. And I want to talk today briefly about the relationship between art and digital technology from my own singular perspective. And I want to explain why I believe that KMA's work is not only significant, but also represents the beginnings of something really very exciting and very new in the relationship between artists, audiences, and interactive technology. There are a lot of examples of existing art forms that have engaged with digital technology at their core. During the 80s and 90s, first the music community, then the graphics world, then the film industry, all adopted digital technologies at the heart of their work. And of course, all of these forms were significantly changed and continue to be changed by that engagement. It's increasingly common to find examples of the digital impact from these worlds and others spreading out into theatres, galleries, and throughout our traditional cultural institutions. Profound though these changes are, television, music, film, theatre, image making, all of these existed before the computer, and it's therefore quite possible to imagine their existence in a non-digital world. There is, of course, a new group of work which is predicated on the relationship between the idea and the technology, which has grown over the last 50 years, and which tends to collectively be referred to as digital art. And within this body of work, the kind of work where if you take away the computer, there could be no work, there have been some really kind of extraordinary and very beautiful pieces made. And the whole genre, if you like, is growing apace and is hugely exciting. KMA's work exists in this space. Over the last 6 years, through a combination of accident and design, we've made pieces that have developed a new way, which would be absolutely impossible without the technology, to create performance works, ones which I believe are beautiful and moving. These works, though predicated on the technology, explore and celebrate the human. So let me now explain a little bit more about what our work is and the history of it. I'm going to refer to 3 works that we've made over the last 6 years. Our very first work, made in York, called Dancing in the Streets in 2005, began simply as a series of technical experiments, the main features of which were, first of all, the piece was presented out of doors, after dark, in a public urban space. Secondly, light was projected from above onto the pavement area. And thirdly, the light was interactive and responded to people's movements. And perhaps most importantly of all, there was no rules of engagement. There was no embodied presence, if you like, of the artist, so the piece was just installed and left. And in fact, I think in the case of Dancing in the Streets, it stayed there for 6 months or so. And it was just open for people to step into with as few friends or many colleagues, strangers as they chose, or as indeed were there. And then to sort of make of it what they would. There was no prescription. And all of those basic tenets that we put into this very early experiment have remained throughout all of the work. And with that very simple setup, it immediately became apparent that even with such minimal intervention, people would gather to play with the light, to interpret it, and in their response kind of amplify and transcend the very limited provocations that the work supplied. It became very obvious to us that there was a kind of strong inclination towards empathic playfulness between people who had moments before been complete strangers in this performance space. So that was our kind of first little experiment. And we just saw these little kernels, and this is one little example. They were just a series of little digital sketches. And they really were just doodles. Give the next slide, please. Over the next few years, KMA created works, most notably Flock, that developed these responses by doing a number of things. One of which was to create pieces that acknowledged mainstream theatric traditions of ballet and opera, and were presented much more as a kind of interactive public theatre. There are a number of reasons why we wanted to do that. One was we wanted to help develop simple narratives that people might recognise in order to see if we could take what had happened in Dancing in the Streets and try to see really how far we could develop that sense of inquiry and play into a more complex emotional experience. So in order to do that, we made the work on a considerably larger scale than we'd done previously. And we added a musical score, and that gave us at least 2 new elements. One was clearly the theatrical and emotive quality that a piece of music brings, particularly a piece of music like Swan Lake, which we use for this. But also, of course, what it does give you is a very set time-based relationship for the work, so that the piece begins to have a structure with an obvious beginning, a middle, and an end, even though the contents of that structure might be entirely interactive. So it's clear from this even that Flock clearly became far more performative. We'd find audiences gathering to watch. And the relationship between audiences and performers became increasingly blurred, as people would sort of dip a toe in the performance area and then stand back to watch. So this kind of osmotic relationship that began to develop. And also, interestingly, both performers and audiences would regularly applaud at the end of each cycle of the work. So there's this kind of implication that people recognize the theatrical engagement they're all involved in. And that sense of collective inquiry and empathy that we first saw at the beginning of Dancing in the Streets, while still largely just a playful engagement, was hugely enhanced. So if we could now move, if we may, to slide 3. So our most recent work, a piece called Congregation. And there was 3 or 4 years of development between the last piece and this. So most recently with Congregation, the work is really focused on this collective empathic response that we noticed developing from Dancing in the Streets through to Flock. And it's taken that kind of instinct, if you like, that response, and attempted to understand and develop it in order to lead the work and its participants into more complex emotional territory. So to do that, we added a number of properties to the work. First of all, we had a secondary projection that kind of relayed to the public a sort of bird's eye view of the performance, so they could see themselves in the patterns and the physical spatial relationships that they were collectively making. We also added a representational element to the visual projected layer on the floor. In the case of Congregation, it's a central prone human figure. And tied to that, we introduced a narrative theme. In this piece, it's a sort of exploration of the ritual response towards belief. And we also commissioned a musical score rather than borrowing something very familiar from the canon. So when you put all those things together, Congregation was altogether a kind of more complex and less immediately obvious piece. The overwhelming response from participants made it very clear that the work held the power to congregate really quite disparate assemblies of strangers who would come together in city centres over very long periods of time. I mean, an hour, maybe 2, even longer in some cases. And for the first time, we built work that was deliberately built around an emotional journey, a journey that counterpointed the public's kind of extempore responses with a very prescribed narrative that provoked and directed the participants' responses throughout the work. For us, I mean, Congregation was a huge step forward. It's over double the length of any of our previous works. And it was our first attempt to make an interactive digital piece that could guide its participants through a sustained emotional narrative, while still allowing them kind of an individual and collective freedom to generate unique responses. And although the language is still rudimentary, we were, I think, finally aiming to create public theatre in the truest sense. Can we move on to the slide? It's very hard. One of the problems with the work is it doesn't really video very well, and certainly doesn't get the sense across of what it feels like to be in one of these pieces. So I'm going to, if I may, just for those whose eyes are as poor as mine, read this out briefly. This is from in fact, this and the following quotes are all just gleaned from the internet, from people who've written on blogs or emails or whatever. So this is from a piece, this is from Bournemouth, the Bournemouth version of Congregation. At 8 p.m, once it was deemed just dark enough, KMA's crane was once again raised and the installation's generator was turned on. The square was sparsely populated as Bournemouth's busy and sunny day had given way to an autumnal grey twilight. Something quite magical happened when Congregation started. There were only around 30 people in the square, but they all seemed to literally stop in their tracks and start to play. Some people had returned to the piece having experienced it the previous night. I hadn't been able to get it out of my head. As we were stewarding for the evening, we had the opportunity to talk to quite a few people who just wanted to know what was going on. People were saying it's the best thing I've seen in ages. Others wanted to know how it worked. Another couple who looked to be in their late 70s stopped and stared before succumbing and leaping into the light themselves. University students promised to try to get friends down to flash mob the site, and others simply wished Bournemouth could always be like this. For most of the afternoon, we'd been stewarding near a couple who were going on to the homeless shelter later that night, one of whom said, Bournemouth can be such a cold, hard place, and look at it now, it's warm, people are all smiling at each other. This is amazing, I love it. Now, if you could just nip on to the next, I'm not going to read these out, and if just leave them up for a few seconds each and then move on. I'm really putting these up, I hope not so much to blow our trumpet, but just to sort of, from our point of view, creating work that is entirely digital, to sort of move people like this was something we're enormously proud of, and certainly something that the earlier work just wouldn't have done. I mean, the first two pieces I showed you got very positive responses, but there was nothing related in any way to this as a kind of emotional response to the piece. Can we have the... Okay, thanks. So as we look to the future and think, where next? What is it about the journey ahead that excites us so much in this kind of developing field? First of all, one of the things I'm interested about in the work is that I think it's very current in the sense that we're living in a culture which is questioning how creative material gets made and how it gets reviewed and how it gets distributed and, well, how it gets experienced. And this work now is actively doing all of those things. But it's kind of outside of the mainstream, I think. It's really beyond the definitions that are currently being used, and it's being explored in a very visceral way. As a participant in a KMA piece, you're kind of potentially audience, performer, and viewer all at once. I mean, viewer as there's a screen, which is relaying performances which people watch. There's also audiences who watch the unmediated live performance, that is unmediated by the screen. And then, of course, there are participants who are involved in the act of performance. And these roles are very interchangeable. They're constantly shifting as people move into a spectator role and then back into performance. But they're also something we're beginning to increasingly play with within a piece. So we kind of deliberately move the participants, the people who are actually within the performance area, quite consciously and deliberately through these different roles. So I think these KMA's urban interventions are deliberately dissolving the distinction between participant and audience. And I believe that that opens up entirely new terrains of creative engagement. We have another slide. Although, yes, it borrows a lot from the ideas of the past and performance ideas too, it's never been possible to make work like this before. And that's entirely, due to its relationship with its medium, the technology. And what that technology, I think, and I'm only beginning to understand this, I think it allows us to do is intervene in these large public engagements and to provoke and corral, to some extent, our audience, stroke performers, participants, in a way in which the artistic ego, if you like, is withdrawn. There's no one to react against or nobody to take issue with. You either walk into one of these spaces and feel engaged or you don't. And there's something in that, I think, in the way in which people share and explore the experience, which is unmediated, as I say, by ego, that allows this extraordinary empathic collective response to develop. And that's really our fuel. I mean, my own personal idea of hell is being corralled into some outdoor public event, like mass salsa dancing or whatever. But in a KMA piece, I'm sort of comfortable because I know that I, just like everybody else there, am on equal terms, exploring the work. I mean, I can be as introspective or extroverted as I choose, and I'm not suddenly going to be used as a stooge for someone else's intent. I can come and go as I please. But of course, there are always performers within a KMA work who, thank God, are more gregarious and less risk-averse than I. And it's they who first begin to explore the space's potential and initially seem to be the most richly rewarded. But this is the basic dichotomy. The more they participate, the more they become a part of a collective body, and the more the collective body borrows from and expands on their participation. The more they become part of a collective body, the less significant their contributions become, except as part of the whole. And so you get this kind of collective empathic response that develops over time between people of really very different dispositions and between those people and the work. And it's this empathy, I think, that fuels and drives our whole attempt at moving this work into some sort of meaningful public theatre. It makes people collectively want to see where this experience is going to take them. And I think it does increasingly take them to some very interesting places. The idea of communities gathering after dark to enact or watch a drama or ritual lies so deep within us and our ancestral history. I mean, it's surely one of the oldest and most essential of human responses to our shared fate. The shared empathic response to participating in this way is a really rare feeling. It's not generated by allegiance or ideology, but simply a common response to the moment. It's strong and it's simple. It's a very sort of basic, simple, primitive feeling. One that summons a sense of connectedness and belonging, I think, between strangers across cultural and linguistic barriers. And I think that last thing is very important about linguistic barriers. So much of our culture and so much online technology is tied directly to language. And we communicate very rarely with our bodies, particularly in these kind of shared public spaces. And I think there's also something interesting about how the very old human instinct to meet in public spaces has been enabled in this empathic, egoless way by very new technology. This coming together of the very ancient and the very new, the very technological and the very human is at the heart of my own excitement with the work. So I kind of believe that this is forming some kind of new art form and one that has the power to move people. But it's clearly at a very early stage. It's very basic, it's very primitive. But I hope I've shown over the last few minutes how KMA's work has evolved from these very simple roots. And that we've learned as much from accident and experiment along the way as we have from design. But that the work is now at a stage where it's considerably more mature and just about, just on the point of being able to do some really interesting things. So looking forward, the next steps for KMA's work, where's it going? I mean, it's a hard one to answer. We're developing new works at the moment, which I hope some of you may get the opportunity to see soon. We're certainly very excited by the possibilities ahead. What I can say, I think, from what I've seen of the work that we've made and the way people responded to it, is that there's most definitely an appetite for this kind of work. And I'm certain that looking into the future, there'll be far more interesting and substantial large public interventions, certainly by KMA, but I hope by many others too, that develop this kind of territory. And finally, I think just to pay lip service to both York, which I'm from, and the new Steam Age, which this is, I just think it feels incredibly privileged and lucky to be at a point in time and a place where the confluence of ideas and technology opens up these entirely new horizons. So, thank you.